So when you buy a home, there is definitely a certain level of excitement and or elation, kind of like a kid at Christmas time with the expectation of Santa coming.
Santa's coming to town!
Santa! Oh my God!
And once the excitement wears off and you come to your senses, you begin to wonder, well, what happens next? Now, whether you bought a home or sold your home, today's video takes you through a typical contract timeline or sequence from the time of acceptance until the close of escrow. Now, I will address the common questions that surround contingencies, inspections, and whether the buyer's deposit is refundable or non-refundable. Hi, I'm Harold Powell, local real estate agent serving Ventura and the surrounding communities. And if you want to stay up to date on real estate for Ventura and the surrounding areas, I suggest subscribing and hitting the bell icon to be notified of future content. In today's video, I will cover a typical 30-day escrow sequence. Now, the actual timeframes listed may be different depending on the offer that the buyer and seller have agreed to. So because of that, I will list on the contract timeline where to look at on the contract to be able to check your specific timeline. Now, most of the timeframes can be found in the first 3 pages of the RPA, or the Real Estate Purchase Agreement, used in California. Also, there are default timeframes for in the contract that may be changed by the buyer to make their offer more attractive, or they can be countered by the seller to accommodate their timeframes or situation. All right, so let's go through this example. So here we have an accepted offer by the buyer and seller with a 30-day escrow. Now, based on the accepted offer, the contract timeline will look like this. Of course, your particular agreement may have different timeframes, and as I mentioned earlier, I've included where you need to look on the RPA in this contract timeline. All right, so as you can see, day 0 begins once the offer and counter has been accepted by buyer and seller, and on day 0, escrow is typically opened if it lands on a business day. Escrow begins to work on putting together escrow instructions for the buyer and the seller, and the title company conducts a thorough title search to ensure that the property's ownership, easements, as well as the ability to transfer clear title to the buyer is met by the close of escrow. Now, escrow will prepare the grant deeds, order title, and city reports, as well as an HOA package if the property has CC&Rs. The seller needs to be aware the escrow will be reaching out to collect money to order the city report and, if applicable, the HOA package. Typically, escrow will have these documents to the buyer and seller within about 10 to 12 days of opening escrow. Now, buyer and seller are expected to sign and return the instructions within 5 days of receipt. The seller will need to notarize the grant deed, which can be done at the escrow office or find a local notary if you're located outside the area. Now, as we look at the contract timeline, by day 3, the earnest money is due. And escrow will send a wire of instructions for the buyer to wire the funds back to escrow. In this example, the buyer needs to wire $30,000 to escrow within 3 business days of acceptance. Typically, a buyer's deposit, again, will be between 2 and 3% of the sale price. Now, there's a couple things to be aware of regarding the term days. Days means calendar day or days. The exception to this is the delivery of the buyer's deposit to escrow, which is based on business days. The buyer should know that the deposit also counts towards their down payment. So in this example of $30,000 deposit counts towards the total down payment of $200,000. So the buyer will have to wire the balance of the down payment of $170,000 plus their closing costs a few days before escrow closes. All right. So let's address the buyer's deposit question here. The buyer's deposit is refundable up until the buyer removes all of their contingencies, meaning that during the discovery phase of inspections, disclosures, and or loan contingency period, the buyer may be able to back out of the transaction with their full deposit being returned to them minus any incurred fees. It's not until the buyer has removed all of their contingencies that the seller would have a legal claim of damages if the buyer elected to cancel at that point. Now, you'll notice that the verification of buyer's funds is due within 3 days of acceptance. This is typically provided with the offer along with a pre-approval letter so that the seller is aware of the buyer's capacity to perform before acceptance. This is significant since in our current market, the seller may have several offers to choose from, and the seller is likely to choose the offer that not only nets them the most money, but also provided evidence upfront of their ability to purchase the property. Now, by day 7, the seller's disclosures are due, and the seller is required to fill out the seller transfer disclosure statement and a seller property questionnaire, which discloses what the seller knows about the condition of the property. In addition to the disclosures, the required point of sale reports, such as the sewer lateral report that is required by the City of Ventura, must also be provided within this time frame. I will say that sooner is better than later, since the default is that the buyer will have the latter of the 2 time frames of either 17 days or 5 days upon receipt and review and approve. So if the buyer doesn't receive them by day 15, then the buyer now has till day 20 to back out of the contract for anything discovered in the disclosures. Ideally, the buyer will often want to have the disclosures before the home inspection, so that the home inspector can review any items that may be of concern. Day 12, the inspection contingency. Since the inspection contingency in this example is due by day 12, the buyer and the buyer's agent will be arranging for a home inspection shortly after opening escrow. In addition to the home inspection, the buyer may elect to have the roof, the HVAC, chimney, or termite inspection done during this period. Since the inspection period is one of the most common reasons for a transaction to fall apart, I suggest the seller watching my video on how to prepare for home inspections and request for repair to help navigate this process well before the inspections take place. Now, after all the inspections are completed, the buyers will review the reports with their agent and typically submit a request for repair for items of concern on or before the contingency date is due. And the seller in turn reviews the request with their agent and decides to accept, modify, or decline the request. And once the buyer and seller have agreed on the repair for request, the buyer can remove the inspection contingency. Now, if for some reason the buyer and seller can't come to an agreement and cancel at this point, the buyer's deposit again is going to be returned back to the buyer. Now, if the property is located in a homeowners association, the buyer will have, again, the latter of 2 time frames of either 17 days or 5 days upon receipt to review and approve the CC&Rs and HOA package. As mentioned earlier, the escrow will need to have the seller pay for the HOA documents when they are ordered within 3 days of acceptance. Delaying the documents being ordered, again, may delay this contingency from being removed by the buyer. Day 15, sign and return the escrow paperwork. Both buyer and seller are to sign and return the escrow paperwork within 5 days of receipt. Typically, the escrow will prepare the escrow documents and mail them to both buyer and seller within, again, 10 to 12 days of opening escrow. And the seller will need to notarize the grant deed by either coming into escrow, or if they live out of area, they can meet with a local notary in their location and then mail the documents back to escrow. On the buyer side, there is the preliminary title report, which will let the buyer know of any easements to the property. Common easements are going to be for utility company access that are usually in the front or back of the property. Now, there may be an additional road easement that will need to be reviewed at this time as well. All liens that are found on the property actually will be paid off at the close of escrow. Some recurring liens, such as property taxes, will be prorated upon the close of escrow. So by day 17, there are 3 timelines due. Number 1, the buyer signed disclosures. The buyer should have received the seller disclosures actually shortly after opening escrow to review. The other items that the buyer will need to review and approve by this time includes the natural hazards disclosure, city report, HOA docs, and any other seller inspections that were done. Now, this timeline could end up getting extended since the buyer again is granted 5 days from receipt to review a report. disclosure document and or HOA package before having to remove that contingency. So you need to be aware of that. Number 2, appraisal contingency. The lender will typically order the appraisal once the buyer has paid for the appraisal to be done. Now, in order to meet this deadline, the appraisal should be ordered and paid for within the first 3 days of acceptance. So the reason for the appraisal is that the lender needs a third party to verify that your house is worth the sale price that buyer and seller have agreed to. That being said, the seller should make sure the home is ready to show, just as it was when the buyer saw it. Additionally, if the seller has made significant upgrades, renovations, then providing a list along with the approximate cost is helpful to bringing the appraisal value in at sale price. Number 3, the loan contingency. Once the lender has full underwriting approval along with the appraisal, the buyer can safely remove the loan contingency. Now, this is typically the last contingency that needs to be removed by the buyer. Now, if the buyers haven't removed it by day 17 in this example, then the seller has the option to send them a notice to perform, which puts the buyer on notice to remove the contingency within the next 48 hours of receipt. Now, if it's not removed within that 48-hour period, then the seller has the right to cancel the transaction, but cannot keep the buyer's deposit since, again, the buyer has not removed the loan contingency. Now, this notice to perform can also apply to the inspection time frame as well. And as far as the buyer goes, the buyer will use the buyer contingency removal form to remove the appropriate contingencies as the transaction progresses in order to avoid receiving a notice to perform from the seller. All right, there is one pro tip to be aware of when it comes to performance dates. If the scheduled performance day for any act required by the agreement, including close of escrow, lands on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, the performing party shall be allowed to perform on the next day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. So, as an example, if the loan contingency date lands on a Saturday, the buyer would have until Monday, unless Monday is a holiday, to remove the loan contingency. Now, once the buyer has removed all the contingencies at this point, and the buyer for some reason decided to cancel the agreement, then the seller would have legal claim to the buyer's deposit. Otherwise, once the buyers have full loan approval, the buyer will sign the consumer disclosure from the lender, which outlines all the lender terms and conditions 3 days prior to signing the loan docs. In the meantime, escrow will be providing the seller with an estimated net closing statement for the seller to review and approve. Now, next, by day 25, we have the buyer walkthrough being scheduled. And the buyer walkthrough is used to verify that any repairs that were agreed to in the agreement have been completed and that the property is in the same relative condition as when they saw it. It's not a contingency like a home inspection. So again, this is not a place for buyers to ask for additional repairs to be done in order to close escrow. The walkthrough is usually scheduled sometime between 1 and 5 days prior to the close of escrow. And at this point, the seller will also be scheduling utilities to be turned off and getting the home insurance set up to be canceled. In the meantime, the buyers will be scheduling utilities to be turned on in their name. Moving on to day 27. Now, at this point, the buyer signs the loan docs and sets up the balance of funds to be wired to escrow. After loan docs are signed by the buyer, the lender will typically set up the funding with the loan within the next business day so that escrow can then set up the recording for the following day, which is day 30. And in this example, we had possession given to the buyers at the close of escrow. And possession is the term used as to when the seller will have vacated the property. Sometimes additional possession days are needed for the seller to move from their current residence to the next residence. So, in this example, the seller will have moved out before noontime on day 30, because usually we receive confirmation that the recording of the grant deed has taken place sometime between 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. Now, once confirmation is received, the buyers are given the keys and full access to the property. Now, if you found this video helpful, leave a comment or give it a thumbs up. Thanks.